Hello. I realize the recording quality kind of sucks, but it's a journey. Now we're like halfway through chapter 6. Phyllis, a self-proclaimed couch potato, began therapy with me with a great deal of ambivalence. Her third brand of antidepressants no longer worked, and her daily use was making her increasingly paranoid. Fantasies of dying were becoming more frequent and morbid. She told me, "I know therapy won't help, but I'm afraid my husband is going to leave me. He says I'm starting to scare him." Phyllis managed being married because her husband paid the bills and left her alone with her TV shows, science fiction books, and online browsing. Additionally, she was a workaholic, rarely around and gone in the computer when he was home. In our therapy, trust building was a long, gradual back and forth process. This is not uncommon with many survivors, regardless of their 4F type. Phyllis' dark sense of humor was a saving grace and helped her weather my psychoeducation. She frequently met my attempts to link her current suffering and her awful childhood with sarcastic rebuttal. Ha! Fortunately, growing up in New York gave me some resilience to sarcasm. I was willing to weather her sardonic sense of humor because there was no mean-spiritedness to it. Eventually, I was able to help her direct the angry part of her sarcasm at her bullying family. With that, my psychoeducation finally began to seep in with a ring of truth. She gradually began to angrily vent about her father's sexual abuse, her mother's silent collusion, and all of the family using her for target practice. This in time morphed into crying, which rewarded her with her first ever experience of self-compassion. It was not until we reached this stage, some years into therapy, that Phyllis got a glimpse of the vicious inner critic that persecuted her. Prior to this, she rebuffed my critic ravings as absurd. When we progressed sufficiently with the inner critic, the same process occurred with my hypothesis that she had a great deal of underlying fear and anxiety that was keeping her housebound. She laughed with a great deal of ironic amusement. "Look at me, Pete. Nothing scares me. I'm so relaxed that I can hardly hold my body up in this chair. Geez, I'm always nodding. My husband calls me mellow yellow." Phyllis is blonde. A breakthrough eventually happened when she passed a man on the sidewalk outside my office that was a doppelganger for her father. She came into the session on the verge of hyperventilating. As I helped her slow and deepen her breathing, she had a therapeutic flashback in the office. She had a horrifying memory of her father sneaking into her bedroom at night. Much grieving then resolved this particular flashback to her sexual abuse. Phyllis's denial shrunk significantly in this session. She really got that social anxiety was imprisoning her on her couch. Deep-level recovery work then ensued from this point in time, and culminated with Phyllis feeling emboldened enough to go back to school. She went on to become a medical assistant. This in turn opened the door to her finding a meaningful place in the outside world. A key part of the meaningfulness was the healthy relationship that she developed with a fellow worker who was also in recovery. The progression of recovery for a freeze type is often as follows. Gradual trust building allows the recovery to open to psychoeducation about the role of dreadful parenting in his suffering. This then paves the way for the work of shrinking his critic, which in turn promotes the work of grieving the loss of the childhood. The anger work of grieving is especially therapeutic for freeze types as in aerobic exercise regime. Both help resuscitate the survivor's dormant will and drive. The fawn type and the codependent defense. Fawn types seek safety by merging with the wishes, needs, and demands of others. They act as if they believe the price of admission to any relationship is the forfeiture of all their needs, rights, preferences, and boundaries. The disenfranchisement of the fawn type begins in childhood. She learns early that a modicum of safety and attachment can be gained by becoming the helpful and compliant servant of her exploitive parents. A fawn type codependent is usually the child of at least one narcissistic parent. The narcissist reverses the parent-child relationship. The child is parentified and takes care of the needs of the parent, who acts like a needy and sometimes tantruming child. When this occurs, the child may be turned into the parent's confidant, substitute spouse, coach, or housekeeper, or she may be pressed into service to mother the younger siblings. In worst-case scenarios, she may be exploited sexually. Some codependent children adapt by becoming entertaining. Accordingly, the child learns to be the court jester and is unofficially put in charge of keeping his parents happy. Pressing a child into codependent service usually involves scaring and shaming him out of developing a sense of self. Of all the 4F types, fawn types are the most developmentally arrested in their healthy sense of self. Recovering from a polarized fawn response. Fawn types typically respond to psychoeducation about the 4Fs with great relief. This eventually helps them to recognize the repetition compulsion that draws them to narcissistic types who exploit them. The codependent needs to understand how she gives herself away by over-listening to others. Recovery involves shrinking her characteristic listening defense, as well as practicing and broadening her verbal and emotional expression. I've seen numerous inveterate codependents become motivated to work on their assertiveness when they realize that even the thought of saying no triggers them into an emotional flashback. After a great deal of work, one client was shocked by how intensely he disassociated when he contemplated confronting his awful boss's behavior. This shock then morphed into an epiphany of outrage about how dangerous it had been to protest anything in his family. This in turn aided him greatly in overcoming his resistance to role-playing assertiveness in our future work together. With considerable practice, this client learned to overcome the critic's voice that immediately short-circuited him from ever asserting himself. In the process, he remembered how he was repeatedly forced to stifle his individuality in childhood. Grieving these losses then helped him to work at reclaiming his developmentally arrested self-expression. Recovering from the fawn position will be explored more extensively in the next chapter. Trauma hybrids. There are, of course, few pure types. Moreover, each type is on a continuum that runs from mild to extreme. Most trauma survivors are a hybrid of the 4Fs. Most of us have a backup response that we go to when our primary one is not effective enough. Neither of these work. We generally then have a third or fourth go-to position. Here are some common hybrids. The fight-fawn hybrid. The fight-fawn type corresponds with the charming bully described earlier. This type combines two opposite polarities of relational style narcissism and codependence. Narcissistic entitlement, however, is typically at the core of fight-fawn type. This type in the extreme can also be borderline personality disorder. She can frequently and dramatically vacillate between the fight and fawn defense. When the fight-fawn type is upset with someone, she can fluctuate over and over between attacking diatribes and fervent declarations of caring in a single interaction. The fight-fawn is more deeply understood by contrasting him with the fawn-fight, described in the next chapter. The fawn-fight type is also subject to vacillating during an emotional flashback, but typically does so with less vitriol and entitlement. The fight-fawn also differs from the fawn-fight in that his caretaking often feels coercive and manipulative. It is frequently aimed at achieving personal agendas which range from blatant to covert. Moreover, the fight fawn rarely takes any real responsibility for contributing to an interpersonal problem. He typically ends up in the classic fight position of projecting imperfection onto others. This essentially narcissistic type is also different than the fawn-flight, in that entitlement is typically more ascendant in the fight fawn. His fawn behavior is typically devoid of real empathy or compassion. I have worked with several clients who were unfairly labeled borderline by themselves or others. I could, however, tell by the quality of their hearts that they were not. This was evidenced by their essential kindness and goodwill to others, which they always return to when flashbacks resolve. They also exhibit this in their ability to feel and show true remorse when they hurt another, as we are all destined to do from time to time. Unlike the true borderline who has a narcissistic core, they can sincerely apologize and make amends when appropriate. Another variant of the fight fawn is seen in the person who acts like a fight type in one relationship while fawning in another. An example of this is the archetypal henpecked husband who is a tyrant at work and who also stays at work to all hours because he so prefers the fight stance. This also occurs in reverse: monster at home and lovely lady at the office. The fight-freeze hybrid. The flight-freeze hybrid type is the least rational and most schizoid hybrid. He prefers the safety of do-it-yourself isolationism. Sometimes this type may be misdiagnosed as Asperger's syndrome. The flight-freeze type avoids potential relational re-traumatization with an obsessive-compulsive dissociative two-step. Step 1 is working to complete exhaustion. Step 2 is collapsing into the vegging out and waiting until his energy reaccumulates enough to relaunch into step 1. The price of this type of no longer necessary safety is a severely narrowed existence. The flight-freeze cul-de-sac is more common among men, especially those traumatized for being vulnerable in childhood. This then drives them to seek safety in isolation or intimacy-light relationships. Some non-alpha type male survivors combine their flight and freeze defense to become stereotypical technology nerds. Telecommuting is, of course, the preferred mode. Flight freeze types are the computer addicts who focus on work for long periods of time and then drift off dissociatively into computer games, substance abuse, or sleep binging. Flight freeze types are prone to becoming porn addicts. When in flight mode, they obsessively surf the net for phantom partners and engage in compulsive masturbation. When in freeze mode, they drift into right-brain sexual fantasy world if pornography is unavailable. Moreover, if they are intimacy-like relationships, they typically engage more with their idealized fantasy partners than with their actual partner during real-time sexual interactions. The fight-freeze hybrid. These types rarely seek recovery on their own initiative. A colleague of mine told me about fight-freeze types who was dragged into therapy by his wife. She complained that she was lucky to get 10 words from him in a week. She was at the end of her rope, and if therapy did not fix him, she was filing for divorce. The husband was a computer engineer who telecommuted and only left his home office for bathroom breaks and meals, which were eaten separately from his wife. He bullied his wife into providing these meals according to a written schedule that he emailed to her. My colleague's initial hello to the husband was met with a scowl and a grunt. Intuitively, she kept the focus off him as much as possible, but each delicate attempt to make connection with him was rebuffed with sarcastic scorn. You expect me to fall for that phony smile? You're not going to shrink me with your psychobabble. My colleague, who is the most compassionate, non-intrusive person I know, was not able to crack the prickly fight shell that guarded this poor man's extreme social withdrawal. No miracle was performed, and my colleague said she was amazed in retrospect that he even lasted 20 minutes before he left in the wake of hostility and resentment. I have met fight-freeze types a few times in similar circumstances, i.e. they were dragged into therapy under the threat of divorce. Each was like a character in a famous poem. The autocrat at the breakfast table. The fight-freeze is a yin or passive narcissist. He demands that things go his way, but he is not much interested in having any human interaction. No one gets to talk at the table, not even him. Unless, of course, someone needs to be put in their place. The fight-freeze type is John Wayne couch potato, dominating family life with a foul mood of monosyllabic grunts and curses. He is typically as untreatable as the extreme fight types mentioned earlier. Self-assessment. I recommend that you self-assess your own hierarchical use of the 4F responses. Try to determine your dominant type and hybrid, and think about what percentage of your time is spent in each of the 4F responses. You can also assess where you lie on the relevant continuums that stretch between the two extremes in each line of the chart below. Continuum of positive and negative 4F responses. Fight, assertiveness or bullying. Flight, efficiency or drivenness. Freeze, peacefulness or catatonia. Fawn, helpfulness or servitude. Recovery and self-assessment. As stated earlier, a key goal of recovery is to have easy and appropriate access to all of the 4Fs. There are also 2 more continuums that can be used to assess this. The degree to which we are balanced along each of them reflects the degree of our healing. The fight-fawn continuum of healthy relating to others. Healthy relating occurs when 2 people move easily and reciprocally between assertiveness and receptivity. Common and important examples of this are an easy back and forth, between talking and listening, between helping and being helped, and 3, between leading and following. Normal, healthy narcissism and codependence happens at the midpoint of the continuum. To the degree that I polarize to the narcissistic fight end of the continuum, I monologue and dominate the conversation. To the degree that I polarize to the codependent fawn end, I get stuck in a listening defense, hiding from the vulnerability of showing what I think and feel. Conversations, of course, will not be exactly in the middle, or it would be a ping-pong-like exchange of monosyllables. Monosyllables. The real balance occurs more over time. For instance, in an hour's conversation, we each generally talk about half the time. The flight-freeze continuum of healthy relating to self. A healthy relationship with yourself is seen in your ability to move in a balanced way between doing and being, between persistence and letting go, between sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system activation, and 4, between intense focus and relaxed daydreamy reverie. Chapter 7. Recovering from trauma-based codependency. If you assessed yourself in the last chapter as a fawn subtype, or as being on the right side of the fight-fawn spectrum, you may find this chapter relevant if the fawn response is not your primary position. Moreover, the first section below contains important information about the origin of all types. I have dedicated a whole chapter to codependency because it is the 4F trauma response that I know the most about. This knowledge comes from my own personal recovery journey and from specializing in treating codependency over the last 2 decades. I wrote the gist of this chapter one Satori blessed night when I noticed that I anxiously apologized to a chair that I had bumped into. I think I probably apologized to an inanimate object many times before in my life, but this was the first time I noticed it. Realizing that I had just apologized to a chair suddenly made me feel enraged. I felt furious that something had happened to me to give me a Pavlovian "I'm sorry" response. Pavlovian. To give me a Pavlovian "I'm sorry" response. I had been pursuing family of origin exploration for quite some time, and the accumulated evidence quickly convinced me that my parents deeply imprinted me with a fawn response. I was brainwashed with a default program to ingratiatingly apologize when anything in the natural order of things changed around me. Suddenly, anxiety responses to apparently innocuous circumstances, like my examples, are often emotional flashbacks to early traumatic events. Sometimes a current event can have only the vaguest resemblance to a past traumatic situation, and this can be enough to trigger the psyche's hard wiring for fight, flight, freeze, and fawn response. In this case, I fawned to the chair, subliminally experiencing it as a dangerous parent and codependent, apologizing to it like a toddler anticipating punishment for touching something forbidden. As I freeze associated on this, I also realized that I was addicted to apologizing. I had apologized for long traffic lights, for changes in the weather, and most especially for other people's mistakes and bad moods. Comparing my fawn origins with fight, flight, and freeze origins. I chose the name fawn for the fourth F in the fight, flight, freeze, fawn typology because, according to Webster, it means to act servilely, to cringe, and flatter. I believe it is this response that is at the core of many codependent behavior. As a toddler, the codependent learns quickly and that protesting abuse leads to even more frightening parental retaliation. Thus, she responds by relinquishing her flight response, deleting no from her vocabulary and never developing the language skills of healthy assertiveness. Moreover, many abusive parents reserve their most harsh punishments for talking back and hence ruthlessly extinguish the fight response in their children. Unfortunately, this typically happens at such an early stage that they later have little or no memory of it. The future codependent also learns early on that her natural flight response intensifies her danger if she tries to flee. "I'll teach you to run away from me," is a common response that precedes spanking, typically awarded to such behavior. Later, when the child is older, she may also learn that the ultimate flight response, running away from home, is hopelessly impractical and even more danger-laden. Traumatizing families, however, seem to be on the rise, as there is an epidemic of children as young as preteens becoming runaways and ending up in dire circumstances. Many toddlers, at some point, transmute the flight urge into the running around in circles of hyperactivity. This adaptation works on some level to help them escape from the uncontainable feelings of abandonment melange. Many of these unfortunates later symbolically run away from their pain. They deteriorate into the obsessive-compulsive adaptations of workaholism, busyholism, spendaholism, and sex and love addiction that are common in flight types. The toddler who bypasses the adoption of the flight defense may drift into developing the freeze response and become the lost child. This child escapes his fear by slipping more and more deeply into disassociation. He learns to let his parents' verbal and emotional abuse go in one ear and out the other. It is not uncommon for this type to devolve in adolescence into the numbing substance addiction of pot, alcohol, opiates, and other downers. The future codependent toddler, however, wisely gives up the fight, flight, and freeze responses. Instead, she learns to fawn her way into the occasional safety of being perceived as helpful. It bears repeating that the fawn response is often one of the gifted children that Alice Miller writes about in The Drama of the Gifted Child. She is the precocious one who discovers that a modicum of safety can be purchased by becoming variously useful to her parent. Servitude, ingratiation, and obsequiousness becomes important survival strategies. She cleverly forfeits all needs that might inconvenience her parents. She stops having preferences and opinions that might anger them. Boundaries of every kind are surrendered to mollify her parents, to repudiate their duty of caring for her. As we saw in the last chapter, she is often parentified and becomes as thoroughly helpful to the parent as she can. I wonder how many therapists besides me were prepared for this career in this way. All this loss of self begins before the child has many words, and certainly no insight. For the budding codependent, all hints of danger soon immediately trigger servile behaviors and abdication of rights and needs. These response patterns are so deeply set in the psyche that as adults, many codependents automatically respond to threat like dogs, symbolically rolling over on their backs, wagging their tails, hoping for a little mercy and occasional scrap. Webster's second entry for fawn is to show friendliness by licking hands, wagging its tail, etc., said of a dog. I find it tragic that some codependents are as loyal as dogs to even the worst masters. Finally, I have noticed that extreme emotional abandonment, as described in Chapter 5, also creates this kind of codependency. The severely neglected child experiences lack of connection as traumatic and sometimes responds to this fearful condition by overdeveloping the fawn response. Once a child realizes that being useful and not requiring anything for herself gets her some positive attention from her parents, codependency begins to grow. It becomes an increasingly automatic habit over the years. A definition of trauma-based codependency. More than a few of my clients were initially put off by the term codependent. They found it confusing or irrelevant because the description they read or heard were presented derogatorily. Moreover, some felt that the descriptions did not pertain to their condition. If that is true for you, the section below on codependent subtypes explains how the fawn response can manifest in a variety of different behaviors. I define trauma-induced codependency as a syndrome of self-abandonment and self-abnegation. Codependency is a fear-based inability to express rights, needs, and boundaries in a relationship. It is a disorder of assertiveness characterized by a dormant fight response and a susceptibility to being exploited, abused, and/or neglected. In conversations, codependents seek safety and acceptance in relationship through listening and eliciting. In conversations, codependents seek safety and acceptance in relationships through listening and eliciting. They invite the other to talk rather than risk exposing their thoughts, views, and feelings. They ask questions to keep the attention off themselves because their parents taught them that talking was dangerous and that their words were indictments that would inevitably prove them guilty of being unworthy. The implicit code of the fawn type is that it is safer to listen than to talk, to agree than dissent, to offer care than to ask for help, to elicit the other than to express yourself, and to leave choices to the other rather than to express preferences. Sadly, the closest that the unrecovered fawn type comes to getting his needs met is vicariously through helping others. Fawn types generally enhance their recovery by memorizing the list of human rights in Toolbox 2, Chapter 16. I have the sardonic fantasy about two codependents going on their first date. However, they have agreed that they want to go to a movie. But how will they ever choose which one? What do you want to see? Oh, I'm easy. What do you want to see? It really doesn't matter to me. I like everything. Me too. Why don't you choose? Oh, I think it would be much better if you pick. Oh, I couldn't. I never pick the right one. Me too, but I'm sure my pick would definitely be the worst. And so it goes, an infinitum, until it's too late to see any show, and relieved in not having to put themselves out there, they call it a night. Codependent subtypes. I think a certain amount of confusion about codependency can be clarified through understanding the significant differences found in the three codependent subtypes that follow: fawn-freeze, fawn-flight, and fawn-fight. Fawn-freeze, the scapegoat. The fawn-freeze is typically the most codependently entrenched subtype. Not all scapegoats are fawn-freeze, but since fawn and freeze types are both prone to extreme self-denial, many end up in a scapegoat position. This is also because these are the two most passive of the four Fs. They have both typically suffered the most punishment or rejection for asserting themselves in toddler stage. When the fawn-freeze is not able to escape the scapegoat role in childhood, she is then set up to be similarly victimized in adulthood. The worst-case scenario fawn-freezes are easily recognized by fight types who take them captive. They may then turn them into doormats and subject them to domestic violence. Sometimes the fawn-freeze does not even recognize she is being abused. Other times she blames herself, as she had to in childhood. Moreover, as we know from studying the DV cycle, many narcissistic abusers know when and how to shower romantic tidbits on their victims, just when they're at the point of leaving. These narcissists are often the charming bullies described in the last chapter. Their infrequent tidbits have more warmth in them than anything the codependent received at home. So she quickly becomes rehooked, and just as quickly the cycle of abuse begins again. It's important to note that many charming bullies also offer copious tidbits briefly in the courtship stage. But these peter out to near starvation rations once the entrapment is complete. Many fawn-freeze types only make token efforts at recovery, if they do not avoid it altogether. Often fawn-freezes were forced to so thoroughly abandon their protective instincts that they become trapped in what psychologists called learned helplessness. Finally, there's growing evidence that a significant number of men also silently suffer domestic violence. A male client once told me that no matter how much his wife assaulted him, he couldn't stop himself from saying, "I'm sorry," to her. This only made her madder, but not as mad as when he flashed back into saying, "I'm sorry for saying I'm sorry," even though his wife would slap him in the face every time he did. Not surprisingly, further investigation revealed a borderline mother who slaps him in the face when she is displeased with him. As a child, he was required to keep his hands down whenever she slapped him. He then had to apologize for making her have to punish him. Unfortunately, he left therapy only after a few sessions because his wife looked in his checkbook and then hit him repeatedly for wasting his time and her money. I have worked a great deal with the fawn-freeze type in my years of doing telephone crisis counseling. Hope for them lies in understanding how their childhood abuse set them up for their current abuse. This is often difficult because scapegoated fawn-freezes were often punished extra intensively for complaining. Numerous times I have heard DV victims say, "But I don't want to act like a victim." Usually, I then try to help them see how much they truly were victims in childhood. However, if I cannot get them to see this, they usually are not able to rescue themselves from their current victimization. Fawn-flight, the super nurse. The fawn-flight type is most typically seen in the busaholic parent, nurse, or administrative assistant who works from dawn until bedtime, providing for the needs of the household, hospital, or company. He compulsively takes care of everyone else's needs with hardly a gesture toward his own. The fawn-flight is sometimes a misguided Mother Teresa type, who escapes the pain of her self-abandonment by seeing herself as the perfect, selfless caregiver. She further distances herself from her own pain by obsessive-compulsively rushing from one parent in need to another. Some fawn-flight clients also become OCD-like cleanaholics. One of my interns told me that her fawn-flight client had a dozen color-coded toothbrushes for various micro-cleaning tasks in her family's bathroom and kitchen. Some fawn-flight, that's funny, I keep abbreviating it to fight, but it is fawn-flights, project their perfectionism on others. They can appoint themselves as honorary advisors and overburden others with their advice. However, it behooves fawn-flights to learn that caring is not always about fixing. This is especially true when the person we are trying to help is in emotional pain. Many times, all that person needs is empathy, acceptance, and an opportunity to verbally ventilate. Moreover, some mood states also need time to resolve. Loving people when they are feeling bad is a powerful kind of